All right, so this is concept 3, energy flow through ecosystems of our unit 3 energy flow unit. All right, so in this concept, we're going to be kind of looking at big picture energy flow. And then in concepts 4 and 5, we're going to zoom in a little bit and look at two processes, photosynthesis and cellular respiration, and look at how those two processes help in this whole system of energy flow. So how does energy flow through ecosystems? Let's get going. So all energy on Earth comes from the sun. All right, so the whole question that we are looking to answer in this unit is, so how do we get that energy? If all energy on Earth comes from the sun, I mean, we already know we can't just walk into the backyard, put on a bathing suit, sunbathe, get tan, and then somehow obtain energy. So there are two ways or two types of organisms, just two primary ways of obtaining energy from the sun. And so the first way is if you are considered a producer. So if you are a producer, you can also be called an autotroph. Okay, and so I'm going to go back to those words in a second. But so producers are organisms that get their energy from non-living sources. And so most producers capture their energy during photosynthesis in order to make food for themselves, to make simple sugars. Okay, and so if you are an organism that is classified as a producer, you are also called an autotroph. And so the prefix auto refers to self, so it means self, and then the suffix troph refers to nourishment. So if you are a producer, that means you are literally a self-nourisher, okay? And that doesn't mean, no, it doesn't mean you walk into the pantry, you can walk into the pantry and then you can grab some Cheez-Its out of there and then start eating, and that's you're self-nourishing yourself. No. So producers have tools within their bodies, within their cells, in order to actually physically capture that energy from the sun. And then convert that to food that they can then perform their own version of cellular respiration on. So yeah, they get their energy from non-living sources like the sun and use photosynthesis. And so some examples of some organisms that do this are plants, algae, and then some various forms of bacteria. So the second way of getting energy is if you are a consumer. And so consumers are also called heterotrophs. And so the term hetero means different. And then, like we already learned, the suffix troph refers to nourishment. So these types of organisms are different nourishers. They receive their nourishment from other sources, so from non-self, if you will. And so we get our energy from living or once living organisms. So either they were alive or they are currently alive. And so some examples from this are animals, fungus, and people. And so down here we have a picture of a shark. And so he is an example, he or she is an example of an animal, or a consumer, or a heterotroph. Remember, there's 5 million different ways to say everything. So let's zoom in specifically on the producer. So we're on this left side over here. So there are two types of processes in order to obtain energy from non-living sources. So over here we have a little little green plant like you all know and love. And then over here on the right we have a bacteria. And so one thing that these organisms have in common is that they use non-living sources for energy. They use non-living sources to make food for themselves. And so on the left, one source of energy, or the source of energy for photosynthesis, is sunlight. And then for this process called chemosynthesis, the source of energy is going to come from chemicals. So zoom out a little bit. What are we talking about? We're talking about producers right here. Remember, they use non-living sources for energy for food, stuff that's not alive or it was never alive. For photosynthesis, these organisms perform photosynthesis, and their source of energy is sunlight. And then on the right, there are specific kinds of bacteria that perform chemosynthesis. They're a producer, but they perform chemosynthesis, and they use chemicals, and they convert chemicals to make energy for themselves. And so you would find these chemicals in something called a salt marsh. If you're not sure what a salt marsh is or what it looks like, it's just a type of environment. And I would just open up a new tab really quickly and then type in what is a salt marsh and then start looking at pictures and you'll go, oh, okay, like I've seen those in movies and stuff. And so basically salt marshes are types of environments where they're really rich in the element sulfur. And so some forms of bacteria can actually use sulfur, much like plants can use sunlight, and they can create their own food through this process. So it's kind of cool. Some examples of some organisms that perform photosynthesis are over here on the left. So green plants and then a type of bacteria called cyanobacteria. And so you don't necessarily need to know that term, but I just want you to know that if I ask you, like what is an example of a producer, I don't want you to, or what are producers, I don't want you to say plants. I want you to say they are organisms that use non-living sources for energy, and they can either perform photosynthesis or chemosynthesis. The ones that perform photosynthesis are green plants and some forms of bacteria, specifically cyanobacteria. Okay, and then so here on the right, we call them this specific type deep sea vent bacteria. It's kind of hard to say. I'm actually surprised I got that right on the first try. But yeah, so there are some bacteria located deep within the oceans, deep within our seas that perform. When they're in the deep ocean, like there's really not a lot of light to go around that deep down there, and so they're actually able to use sulfur, use chemicals down there, so they don't, die. Kind of important. Okay, so that was producers. Now let's look at consumers because we don't want to just leave consumers out. We don't want to make them feel like the third wheel here. Okay, so consumers get their energy by eating other organisms. And so they do this by breaking down the macromolecules inside of the organisms to release ATP in cellular respiration. Okay, so there are 4 types of consumers that eat other organisms for food, for energy. So the first type are called herbivores. And so herbivores only eat vegetation. So they're kind of like vegetarians. The prefix herb refers to plants, grass, stuff like that. So think of herbivores as vegetarians and you'll be a-okay. The second type of consumer are carnivores. And so carnivores eat only meat. And so the prefix carn refers to meat. And you've probably heard one or all or none of these terms before. All right, so the third type of consumer is something called an omnivore. And so these organisms eat both meat and vegetation, and plants. They eat meat and plants. And so the prefix omni refers to all. So all types of food sources, I guess you could say. And kind of just relating this to something I'm not sure if you've talked about in English. If you've ever talked about narrators and from like the different points of view, like first person, second person, third person, and then if you remember omniscient. So when you have an omniscient narrator, they are all-knowing narrators. So just throwing that prefix in, that omni refers to all, so that's why omniscient narrators are all-knowing narrators. And that's why omnivores eat all kinds of food. Okay, and then the fourth and final type of consumer are detrivores or decomposers, either or, they're interchangeable. And so these types of organisms eat dead materials. And so the prefix detri refers to waste or dead things. So so they're eating either dead organisms or organisms waste. Yeah, kind of nasty, but yeah.